Hello, everyone, and welcome to Introduction to Historic Preservation. This webinar is a part of the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts Regional Heritage Stewardship Program. This program is an initiative funded through the National Endowment for the Humanities and pursued in close partnership with the Utah Division of Arts and Museums and Utah Humanities. The RHSP program is an initiative focused on bringing preservation, education, and resources to the Intermountain West region of the United States. This webinar will be recorded and all registrants will receive the link to that within a few days. And so now with that, I will pass it off to today's presenter, Dr. David Amott.
Thank you so much. It's a real opportunity for me to participate in this, this program. It's quite a large topic. When the Conservation Center first reached out to me about doing an introduction to historic preservation, we sort of discussed back and forth for several days what exactly that might look like. Let's see. So after discussing it, we came up with a model, a program that I'll introduce to you here in a few moments. But before we get to that point, I just want to say a little bit more about myself and the organization I represent. As Leah said, my name is David Amott. I'm Executive Director of Preservation Utah. Preservation Utah was the first nonprofit established west of the Mississippi, first statewide nonprofit, to advocate for historic preservation. We were founded in 1966, and in the words of our founder, then First Lady, Lucy Beth Rampton, First Lady of Utah, she said, Preservation Utah was created to exchange hand-wringing for organized effort in relation to historic preservation and saving the rich heritage of the Intermountain region and specifically Utah. And I'd like to think that we've been successfully doing that since 1966. Just a little background on my own educational experience. I went through a master's and PhD program focused on vernacular architecture. One thing about vernacular architecture, which is a field that really emerged in the 1960s and 1970s out of the earlier established folklore programs at universities like the University of Illinois and the University of Pennsylvania, is that it took the approach that the folklorists established through the 20th century when that program, when that field of study was being developed, that everything can tell a story, that it's not just the spoken word or the written word that conveys meaning, that conveys stories, that conveys narrative, but all material culture. And of course, out of that comes then the architectural historic tradition that I was trained in. And it's very much a tradition that influences my presentation for today. So back to the idea of how to present in an hour, less than an hour, what historic preservation means, an introduction to preservation. This is the formula that we here at Preservation Utah and at the Conservation Center came up with. We're going to look at the major folk architecture in the region, discussing dominant types, as well as approaches to preservation that are common in the experience that we have in going out looking at buildings, the sorts of issues that seem to come up over and over again. For the sake of the presentation itself and the organization of the presentation, I decided to bifurcate my message today. First, we'll look at the major folk architecture and folk traditions and stories that come out of the vernacular architecture of the Intermountain region. And then at the end, we'll look at some of the major preservation issues that a lot of the buildings that we engage with seem to have. My hope is that as many of you are in museums, you are museum professionals, some of you might even take care of buildings of a certain age, that you will be able to find in both these segments of my presentation material that can help you in your day-to-day work. When we talk about the vernacular traditions, the the architecture, the popular architecture of the Intermountain region, we're really looking at a huge area that have a number of traditions represented. And of course, I can't talk about all of them within a single hour or within the span of the few minutes that we have today. So what I decided to do is focus primarily on the Euro-American tradition, oftentimes what we commonly refer to as the pioneer tradition, and the buildings that represented the homes and homesteads, especially in agricultural and urban contexts, that pioneers were often known to utilize and establish as they entered into unfamiliar territory and made it their new homes. I am mindful, of course, of all of these other traditions, the earlier Native American traditions that continue throughout, even far into the 20th century. Of course, in the Southwest, you have the Spanish, you have various religious traditions, military traditions. I am aware of that, and I think in the coming decades, more of that will be interpreted and more of that will enter into the mindset of people as they think about the West. But I think in this present moment, when you think about the Intermountain region, if the popular image of the Intermountain region is conjured up in the minds of a lot of your visitors, a lot of your patrons, it's this image here of the pioneers heading west, taming unfamiliar territories and making it their own. And that is certainly the tradition I was raised in as a native of Utah, where I of course live today. So oftentimes as I was growing up, my parents would take me to a park. There would be the swing set and the slide, and just off to the side of that recreational area, there would often be a cabin that would look very much like the one pictured on the screen. This cabin was perennially locked. I don't know if all of you can notice this padlock on the cabin. It would never seem to be open. And when you look through the windows, as I often did, because I was always interested in architecture, you'd see oftentimes just dirty curtains with flies scattered at the bottom of the windowsill. But even though the cabin was, for the most part, inaccessible, oftentimes chained off and unavailable to visitation, it still represented something that I think is extremely powerful in our region, and that is the origin story of our region. The idea of the cabin encapsulating this point of beginning. And of course, the cabin was meant to be seen in context of everything around it, right? A civilization grew from a seed. And what was that seed? It was the lives, it was the effort, it was the energy that is now embodied in this last cabin, right? That still stands in the community in which you live. And of course, this is not just true of the Rocky Mountain region, the Intermountain region, but is a story that is played out over and over again through the American narrative, really from the earliest frontiers at the edges of Pennsylvania and Ohio through the Midwest, and then on to the Pacific Ocean, right? The cabin represented something poignant and powerful. And we weave the cabin, the log cabin, into actual narratives that we tell of actual people, people like Abraham Lincoln. I don't know if any of you have ever been to Kentucky, but Abraham Lincoln has not just one boyhood cabin, but two that are preserved. They've done dendrochronology studies on both of these cabins, and neither one is actually Lincoln's cabin. They were all created well after Lincoln had left his boyhood home and had gone on to bigger political things in Washington, D.C. All the trees were felled essentially around the beginning of the Civil War. So this is a mythology that they assigned to cabins that fit, and they built these temples around them. And something that continues, even though we know that none of these cabins that Lincoln slept in or Lincoln stayed in as a boy were actually cabins that he knew as a child, simply because they were not created when he was still in his youth. And then these cabins continue on into the mythology, the stories, the narratives that are so popular about our region and the West American tradition, from dime store novels at the early 20th century, late 19th, 20th century, to the modern series Yellowstone. Here we have Pie Yellowstone. I don't actually know this family's name. I've never watched one of these episodes. I hear they're pretty good. Anyway, Yellowstone family in their house made of logs and rocks. Can we imagine that they would be as tough or as frontiers-like if they lived in a frame home? No. This cabin, while it's just in the background, provides an important foundation for the character and identity of these people. And this plays out throughout the Intermountain West. I showed you the cabin a few slides ago. Here are some others. This is very familiar to me. Here we have a cabin in a city park, largely ignored, but still there to provide that context, that origin story. Next door to it, we have a gas station, it looks like. Here we have a cabin. I think this is in Colorado Springs, right? Narrated, illustrated with these storyboards. The cabin with the chain link fence falling apart, but still there. This is one of my favorite cabins. This is a cabin that still exists actually in downtown Salt Lake, reportedly the first cabin that was ever built in Salt Lake City. Again, an important point of origin. And what they did in the probably 1920s is built a classical temple around it, right? Out of this came civilization. And the same thing we've done in other parts of the country. This is not what I'm saying uniquely a Western tradition. This is Plymouth Rock. We have Plymouth Rock here in Massachusetts. Of course, it's a piece of stone here in this little tidal basin surrounded by a classical temple. Out of this bit of nature came culture. And the point I'd like to make about the cabin is not that they weren't used in the West, right? Here we have a wonderful picture. I think this one comes out of California. The Elkhorn Palace, or probably Prospector's cabin. What's unique about this cabin is that it has pictures of the inside, and you can see how these prospectors lived in these cramped quarters with every bit of space claimed, every bit of space taken up. So cabins, of course, were used, but what I want to assert is that they were not the only buildings used to start to originate the communities, the culture, the life that we now all experience here in the Intermountain West. There were other solutions beyond the cabin, which I think are also important to study, even though they don't necessarily survive as well as cabins do. Here in the Great Plains area, heading into the Intermountain West, we have what are called soddies. These, of course, are houses that are made literally out of chunks of grassland that they pile on top of each other to make a house. What makes this picture so great is not, of course, the family sprayed out here in front of their soddy, but also the goat on the roof, right? Probably eating some of the grass that is growing out of the sod roof here. The city I grew up in here in Utah did not begin with a cabin, but rather began with dugouts. People were using the hillsides, whatever was easiest, whatever was most readily accessible, whatever could offer the quickest shelter they utilized. That extends to adobe brick. Of course, adobe is a tradition that we mainly associate with the Southwest and parts of California, but it was used really throughout the Intermountain West and is a wonderful material, and so long as you do not get it wet, will serve you well. This house is probably over 150 years old, and for the most part has held up simply because up till this point, the brick has not been exposed to moisture. And then, of course, in other parts where rocks are readily available, they would use those. And so it's sort of this tradition of using whatever you can, whatever is quickest, whatever you can get by with. That is how you start things and then move from there. And these are sort of solutions, right? The ingenuity of these early settlers that we should acknowledge in our interpretation. Another important point to make, though, and this is really made by some of the first students of the vernacular architecture tradition here in America, is that whatever you start with, whatever solution you find to begin, whatever settlement you're trying to establish, is not something that will long satisfy you. As soon as you build your cabin, or as soon as you construct your soddy, as soon as you have solved the problem of shelter, the likelihood is you're already thinking of how to improve it or how to move out of it into something better. And I think that's a wonderful point that is made by this book, by one of my architectural heroes, Abbott Lowell Cummings. He's a hero of many vernacular architectural historians. He's one of the earliest practitioners of this particular field. He's one that championed the study of the everyday dwelling. And he, in particular, was based in Massachusetts. And one thing that he states in his study of 17th century frame houses in Massachusetts is that the early settlers of that region were desperate, absolutely invested in taking what was natural in their world and transforming it through their own efforts into something cultural. This process of making nature into culture was absolutely fundamental to the way that they approached their settlements. And that is true of what was happening in Massachusetts Bay, just as it is true of what is happening in our own region, right? If you live in the Elkhorn Palace, you're not going to want to stay there, right? You're going to want to move on pretty quickly as soon as you can afford to, right? You put the cabin underneath the Greek temple, which is its own sort of nature into culture sort of monument, right? This is such a wonderful thing where you could unpack it all day, right? So you jettison it, and if it happens to survive later on, future generations can enshrine it. But for your own purposes, your own desires, you want to improve, right? You want to move up in the world. This is a painting that I saw in a gallery several years ago, and I just had to buy it, so I did, because it tells this story of transforming nature into culture. Here you have what's probably a log cabin, and you can just, by looking at this house, get a sense of how it's evolved, right? We have the original log cabin, and the family was not satisfied with it. It wasn't big enough for them. It didn't provide all the essentials that they wanted to have at their access. So what did they do? They add a lean-to, right? And then after a certain period of time, this combination is not enough. So they add another addition and then another addition. And then you can tell that the family eventually just got tired of trying to make this work, and they moved a few yards away and built this house, right? And I brought these two pictures together because I think this house is essentially this house, right? And eventually even this house isn't good enough, right? These are both houses really in the same community, a community called Spring City. So this house eventually doesn't suit the needs of the occupants. So what do they do? Here's the original front door of this original, very federal style house with changes of taste and fashion, with the infusion of resource, perhaps an upgrade in your social position. You want to make your federal style house into a very high style queen. So that's what happens here. This is called the Judge House in Spring City, Utah. Not only does, or Judge Johnson House, I'm sorry, not only does Judge Johnson deem that this is insufficient, but he throws on a whole nother wing, complete with a tower, right? Which since the medieval period has suggested power and prestige. He's throwing everything at this house that he possibly can, right? So this desire to constantly improve, to upgrade, to assert status, to assert a certain position, right, is something that these people are invested in, these pioneer settlers, from the moment they finish their cabin to the moment they have their mansion complete. This is another one of these stories. I brought this in because this is just a few blocks away from the house I currently live in. Here we have a cabin. This is another Johnson house, another family named Johnson. We have a cabin. They built it just long enough to provide them shelter until this house is finished. And then a few years after they begin this, they're able to move into it. It's finished enough, and they abandon the cabin, and it basically goes to wreck and ruin until a local preservation-minded homeowner decides to buy both these structures and bring them back, restore them back to their original states, more or less. If you are lucky enough to be interpreting a site that has a house and a collection of outbuildings, my recommendation is to not consider the outbuildings as secondary. They are all very much a part of a larger narrative of evolution, of improvement, of making life work, right? And using architecture to facilitate a certain lifestyle. Another book I would recommend you read, again, for New England. It doesn't touch, of course, on the Intermountain West, but is really instrumental in getting people here to think about how farmsteads worked and how architecturally they were arranged. This is a book, another book by one of my other architectural historian heroes, Thomas Habka. It's called Big House, Little House, Back House, Barn, which traces the evolution of this unique pattern that exists in parts of New England, parts of Maine and New Hampshire and Vermont, of arranging the buildings all in a row. And he comes up with reasons for why this happens, right? And what you can do when you engage with books like this is take their ideas and take their approach to interpreting a landscape and use it on native traditions native to the Intermountain region. So another suggestion of a book you can read to understand a landscape you may interpret, or even the landscape all around us, right? As someone who is sensitive to and experiences landscapes, right? Mindful that they tell stories and that they have things to communicate to us, important ideas and lessons about the past. Ultimately, you find a lot of the architectural traditions here in the Intermountain West, especially those that develop in the early parts of the settlement period, 1840 to about 1870, when the train comes in 1869. These tend to melt away as this new form of transportation, a facilitator of trade. The railroad brings new ideas, new architects, and importantly, new materials to the Intermountain West. The traditions that are established here, that are practiced here before 1869, are quite a bit different from the architectural traditions that you see after that period. And that is because the train has arrived, right? And suddenly this region is far more connected to the rest of the country than it ever has been before. And so you get, for example, this house, which probably came out of a pattern book. This is a pattern book called The Carpenter's Assistant. And it shows you this Gothic revival house that isn't terribly different from this house, once again, which once stood in Salt Lake City. I wish it still did. This is the Godby residence. And you have to know that all of this trim work, all this fretwork was not carved by some local craftsman, but was probably ordered via a catalog and deposited in Salt Lake through a train, right? Transportation that made this sort of decoration that much more affordable, that much more accessible. And the same is true in other types of communities that did not develop with an agricultural foundation, but rather through, for example, in this case, mining. This is a wonderful community in California called Hangtown, a great name. And you can see that there are indeed cabins in Hangtown, but for the most part, they're on the periphery and they're shortly going to be replaced by all of this new type of housing, a new type of building that has been made possible primarily because of the train. For example, these yards and yards, feet and feet of sawed lumber, right? Which probably was not harvested locally, even though this looks like it's up in the mountains. It's probably harvested someplace, maybe in the upper Midwest, and then brought by train to this community in California where it was snatched up and used to make these balloon frame dwellings. Same thing we see in Butte City, Montana. Again, this is probably a community that had many cabins for the initial years of its settlement, but then quickly transformed itself with the arrival of new materials that were brought to this area because of its wealth from the train, and was able to transform itself with this, with the, not just the new materials, but also the ideas that that flooded into this region, architects and pattern books and other things that that the settlement was able to take advantage of. This is a map, I think, from 1884, and as you can see, the city does highlight a number of buildings off to the side of this map, but none of them are log cabins. They're all the buildings that suggest an improvement, that suggest an evolution beyond a scrappy beginning to a more established present and future. An architecture that suggests a certain optimism. And the same thing with train communities as well. This is a wonderful train community, Winslow, Arizona. If you look at the view of this community from Google Maps, you can see that it's completely oriented to the train. Not simple buildings here, rather high style buildings, again, made possible by their connection to the larger world and to the world of ideas and materials. Typically in these train towns, you have a front street that had all sorts of elaborate buildings, and then the town sort of dwindled once you walked past this front street into the blocks, the residential blocks, the secondary commercial blocks and residential blocks that followed, that existed beyond this most prominent street connected with the train and the train lines. And the same is true with mining camps. A lot of times, mining camps did not have simple log cabins, but rather they were established oftentimes in the latter half of the 19th century after the train had arrived and made all this lumber paneling and board and roofing possible. And so you have little miner shacks that look like this, miner shacks that were thrown up quickly with store-bought materials, and for the most part were not meant to endure much beyond a certain 10 or 20 or perhaps 30-year span of life. However long the ore would last would be how long that they were invested in, and then they would quickly disappear, making a lot of this type of housing some of the rarest in the Rocky Mountain region. Of course, in places like Park City or other places in Colorado where these mining towns have now converted into ski towns, you can't buy one of these mining shacks, which would have been thrown up for under $1 million. So it's been interesting to see how they started as hardscrabble housing and now house millionaires who are interested in spending large amounts of the winter skiing in these areas. Some of you, I thought, are perhaps the caretakers of mansions, right, that are made possible in the Intermountain West through mining fortunes or railroad fortunes. or sometimes lumber fortunes, right? All these millionaires that come out of the West, these people who are able to find some natural resource to exploit and then transform their raw materials again into wealth that then helps them to achieve a certain cultural prominence, right? Again, the story of nature into culture. This house is the Utah Governor's Mansion. It didn't start as the Utah Governor's Mansion. Rather, it started as the mansion of a mining baron, Thomas Kearns, here in Utah, who had mines up in Park City. What I think is interesting is that the story of this type of house is integrated very closely to the story of this type of house. This house only exists because of the people who lived their lives out in residences like this. And so to create that tie, right, between the hardscrabble life of the everyday miner and those who were able to use their position, their know-how, their ability to move up in the world, to gain a position in the upper echelons of these mining companies, in some cases even own them, right? And then transform their rocks and logs into materials like this. What I think is interesting about these types of houses is, again, the stories that they tell of nature into culture. We have, in this case, a manifestation of not local products made into culture, but rather foreign imported products and materials. In the case of the Governor's Mansion here, the Thomas Kearns Mansion, we have woodwork that came from South America. We have oak that came from, in some cases, European forests. We have marble tiles here on the floor that came from various parts of the Mediterranean. This desire to associate yourself with the world of empire, right? A common 19th century, early 20th century theme, right? Empire. You also have, in many spaces of this house, the genderization of the rooms. Here we have, for example, on this side originally would be the women's parlor, Mrs. Kearns' parlor, where she would entertain her guests. Before it was remodeled to accommodate a family wedding, I think in the 1920s, this side of the room, the side of the room that is closest to the photographer, looked like this, and this was the gentleman's parlor, right? A world of tobacco and harems and exotic Orientalist themes. By creating these sorts of spaces, these gendered spaces, by using this imported material, they are creating a whole nother level of nature into culture, taking these materials and forming a hierarchy, right, that helps to establish who they are and their position in society, and even how the house itself, the household itself, is organized. And I think what's wonderful is that when you look at some of these opulent mansions here built in the West, in the Intermountain region, by some of these families who made it good on the financial level, you see them very much emulating the East Coast barons and their Gilded Age compatriots in New York City or Boston, who themselves are emulating European aristocracy. And so there's this wonderful sense of hierarchy, which you can make your guests, your visitors, if you are in charge of a house like this, or whenever you go through a house like this, you can be aware of, to understand how the family worked and how this betterment, right, this constant striving for more higher and higher levels of culture operated even in the house representing someone on the top 1% of society. Before I leave the preservation segment of my presentation today, I did want to point out that here in Utah we have a problem, and I think that it's a problem shared by some of the other people that are curators, preservationists in neighboring states. And that is that in Utah, the average person will see a pioneer house or a Gilded Age house as worthy of preservation, but not anything in the latter half of the 20th century. The latter half of the midpoint of the 20th century, this mid-mod architecture, up through the 1970s. 1970 now is 50 years old. That means it's eligible for the National Register of Historic Places. Anything built up to 1970 in America is potentially eligible for the National Register of Historic Places. What we need to do a better job of here in Utah, and I would suggest elsewhere, is acknowledging the importance of these sorts of houses. Again, we have another Johnson house. This one's in Boise. These sorts of houses built in the 50s and the 60s with this unique architecture that really expresses a certain enthusiasm, a certain perspective on the world at this moment in time when America was really at the high point of its development, right? The high point of what is oftentimes called the American century. And to preserve this enthusiasm and to preserve this certain outlook, right, through the architecture that was produced at this time is really important. It's something that we're trying to do here more of in Utah, and something I would encourage the rest of you to think about as well. How do we save the architecture that tells the unique stories of this region from the midpoint of the 20th century up really even through to the present? So that is my little plug for mid-century modern architecture. I'm going to transition into preservation issues now, which are numerous. There's many different sorts of preservation issues that we could discuss. I've chosen the problems that I constantly encounter as a preservation professional here in Utah to discuss, but I did want, before I go into some of those pet issues, I did want to make you aware of the preservation briefs that I know many of you are familiar with, but maybe some of you are not, that have been issued by the National Park Service over the last several decades. These are preservation briefs that are readily available online. You just need to type in preservation briefs, National Park Service, and they are briefs that discuss a variety of topics, almost everything you could ever think to look up. Any of your needs that you could possibly encounter are likely to be discussed in one preservation brief or another. We have preservation briefs on roofing, exterior paint problems, even historic signs, cast iron, slate, all sorts of materials. So if you have not, if you have approached preservation issues related to your site and have not consulted these before you've launched into your project, I strongly encourage you to look them up. If you have impending preservation needs at whatever site that you may be caring for, I would encourage you to start here, because this is easily accessible information and offers you tremendous perspectives on how to resolve whatever preservation issues you might be facing. All right. That being said, I'm going to highlight a few of them, starting with roofs. I see a lot of historic sites with roofs like this. They always say that outside of earthquakes or hurricanes or whatever natural disaster your building might encounter over its long life, all that aside, buildings always fall apart from the top down. And that is because when roofs fell, you have water seepage, and water will destroy everything it can access inside your historic building. So I strongly encourage you to keep your roof tight. If it's growing moss, if it's growing plants like this, that's a real sign that there's a lot of water retention and it needs to be replaced. If your shingles, for example, if you have that roofing material start to look like lace, it's a good sign you're going to be facing a leak very soon. It's time to replace that roof. I think this is something we all inherently understand, but I am surprised at how many historic sites will let their roof go, putting money towards other projects, when really this is the most important resource that your budget could help support or replace or repair, simply because of that fact that buildings always fall apart from the top down. Masonry. There is a real fad currently to paint brick. And this is a big no-no, simply because brick is in many ways like skin. It's like a skin for your building. It's a durable skin, but it has pores and it absorbs water. And once that water is taken into the brick, which it will, by hook or by crook, there's always water infiltrating the exterior of a home. It wants to expel that water eventually. And what happens when you paint brick is that you are basically blocking up the pores of the brick. It's like painting your skin, right? The brick can't breathe. And pretty soon that brick will start to flake simply because it can't release the moisture that's now locked inside of it. Here's a good example of this flaking. You see a lot of paint here, but it's also the brick underneath that's failing. So if you already have a historic building with painted brick, I would strongly recommend that you keep that paint as tight as you can, but also consider eventually taking that paint off. This is a laborious process that needs to be done chemically. Oftentimes people will sandblast brick to get the paint off. This is a terrible idea. I think I have a slide here that shows what happens when you sandblast brick. Here it is. What you're doing is you're taking essentially off the exterior shell of the brick when you sandblast it. And when you do that, you leave the softer interior of the brick, the softer material that exists inside that shell, exposed to the weather. And eventually what will happen is that brick will start to crack. It will start to take in water, and that water will, with the freezing and thawing cycles that are so familiar to us here in the Intermountain region, that brick will start to flake off and eventually disintegrate, all right? So the best thing to do is never paint brick. If your brick's already painted, try to keep that paint from flaking. Try to keep as much water off the bricks as you possibly can. But eventually chemically remove that paint so you don't damage the bricks by sandblasting, because what essentially this does is, like I explained, here it flakes off. In other places I've seen it operate like sandstone, where it just sort of weathers away, melts away. Another real issue that I commonly see, in fact, I saw it this morning during a house visit that I made, one of our Preservation Utah easement properties. The owners had hired a mason to come in because their bricks look very much like this. The original lime mortar had started to disintegrate. So they hired a mason, probably somebody who gave them a pretty good deal on the work that they had done. That mason came in and repointed these mortar joints. Of course, many of you know repointing just means shoving the mortar back into the places where it's failed. They clean out the old mortar and put new mortar back into these places where it no longer exists. But rather than using traditional lime mortar, which is what all historic homes, for the most part, have utilized, this mason used a mixture, a mortar mixture based on cement, Portland cement. And what that does, when you don't use traditional lime mortar, but rather you use a Portland cement mixture, is it creates a mortar joint that is much harder than the brick that it surrounds. So that makes sense. And so basically this mortar will endure far longer than the brick. And what it does is basically imprison the brick and doesn't let the brick expand or contract or respond to changing temperatures or to the influx of moisture and the release of that moisture. It basically puts these bricks into a solid tomb. And the only way they can release stress is by cracking and flaking, which is what you see here. So whenever you have repointing jobs, make sure that the mason is using historically appropriate materials, a lime mortar based on a mortar based on lime rather than a mortar based on concrete. If you have concrete put into your mortar joints, you can get it out, but it's a horrible process that involves basically grinding it away, taking it out by a saw similar to this, and cleaning the brick and then putting in the correct stuff. If you have already put lime or concrete mortar back into bricks, if a previous repointing job, use this concrete mortar. I would strongly recommend that you go through this process, simply because if you don't, eventually the bricks will crack and they will fail. And then my last slide I will use to discuss historic stucco, which is one of my favorite materials. Historic stucco is another mixture. It's actually 3 layers, with the outermost layer using a lime-based stucco mixture. And when this fails, it can be patched. Oftentimes what I see, however, a lot of people do is use a modern stucco mix in the to repair or completely cover a historic building that is covered in historic stucco. And the nature of these two materials is vastly different. I would just encourage you to be sensitive about this. Oftentimes I see a historic building that has been traditionally covered with a lime-based stucco, now covered with a modern stucco, and the combination is really quite jarring. The impact, the effect of a modern stucco is really quite different from that of a historic stucco. So be sensitive to that. And this material, if you treat it well, will last and last and last, unlike contemporary stucco, which oftentimes will fail after 20 or 30 years. And that reminds me, I do have actually one more slide talking about materials that will last and last and last. And many people outside the preservation world do not understand a preservationist's devotion to historic wood windows. We really are devoted as a profession to maintaining historic wood windows, as opposed to replacing them with metal or, even worse, vinyl replacements. And this is because historic wood windows, if they are treated well, will last and last and last. Here we have a window that's, as the caption says, 90 years old, no maintenance. When you consider this has lasted almost 100 years without any maintenance, yes, it's in a broken down state of repair, but it is still remarkably intact. This is a window that has outlasted by decades any material that is available in a modern window shop. And so if you compare this to this, this is a window that's twice as old, 180 years old, and it has 3 rounds of maintenance. You can see just how stable and sturdy these windows are. And if you invest in them, they will pay you back in spades. A lot of people say, well, we have to take out our historic wood windows simply because they are not energy efficient. And I promise you that if you take your historic wood windows and add storm windows to them, you essentially then have a double pane, and they are as energy efficient as any materials you could buy in a modern window store. And more importantly, by preserving these wood windows, you are keeping very much intact the character of your house. It's almost like the house wearing eyeglasses. If you change your eyeglasses, you really have almost a different face, you have a different look, you have a different appearance. And by changing the wood windows, you have the same effect with a house. So please, please be as dedicated to wood windows as we preservationists are, because they will pay you back in spades and can be made of storms and other means, weather stripping and other products. That concludes my presentation. I see that I am 10 minutes out from 2. So that leaves us time to answer a few questions. And I have a question from Megan. Can you share your suggested books in an email? I'd be glad to. And then follow up, given that 1970 is now eligible for historic status, do you have resources restoring these newer old windows? It seems more difficult to find parts for those than the 180-year-old windows. That is true. That is true. Some of the aluminum windows that were oftentimes used in mid-century houses up through the 1980s and even in some cases into the 90s are a bit more difficult to repair. And in some cases, especially when you're dealing with materials that were considered very avant-garde and modern at the time, experimental is oftentimes the best word to use, but now have ceased production because the experiment ultimately failed, you may have to replace them. But there are products that you can use, different sorts of window companies that can, for example, replicate a steel frame window without too much customization necessary to make it more affordable. And ultimately, there are products, I think, that basically convey the sense of the period, the do not jar through their materiality with the design of the house, that are acceptable replacements. That being said, I think most windows, if you call a window expert, can be repaired, can be recalled, can be refurbished. And for those of you who live in Utah, I should take this moment to advertise a service that Preservation Utah provides. It's called our Historic Preservation Directory. If you type in Preservation Directory, Utah, it should appear. And we have listed experts who are able to do that sort of work. So please be aware that we have this preservation directory. These are people that have good reputations, oftentimes are specialists in their field. They can take materials that other less expert contractors would recommend you throw out historic fabric of your building, and they can give it a new life and extend its life for decades, if not centuries. And so be aware that here in Utah, we have that resource. And I think that a lot of other nonprofits, historic preservation nonprofits, if you call them, will also be able to give you recommendations as to who to call to do that sort of very specialized work. We have Carol Scart. Let's see. Thank you, so enjoyed. Where can one get lime mortar? Well, what I recommend you do is contact an expert mason who has a track record with historic buildings. It's really important that you find someone who understands the difference between concrete and lime mortar. And once you find that mason, you can put yourself in his or her hands and know that you're safe. Just make sure that you have chosen someone with that sort of track record. I can tell you, I don't know where you are, Carol, but if you are in Utah, the people to call would be Abstract Masonry. They just recently did the city and county building in downtown Salt Lake using historically appropriate materials. Or you can call Child's Masonry. They're another firm that has worked on the Capitol building here in Salt Lake. They worked on the old Hotel Utah, replacing a lot of the mortar that had fallen out. So if you're in Utah, you can call those people, but every state should have a mason that understands the difference between a modern concrete-based mortar and a more historically appropriate lime mortar. Let's see. Do you perform the biological examinations to detect the mold and insect infection? What lab do you invite for this? Oh, that's a good question. The mold and insect. I've never actually dealt with that problem. I can see how in a museum that would be very much a concern. I actually worked in a museum where we had issues like that when I was, this was a summer job actually with the National Park Service. And ultimately the way we solved that problem was they built a new building and they moved, which may not be the solution that's available to you in your particular situation. If you want to reach out to me, David at preservationutah.org, I'd be glad to research that and find someone who could think of solutions that are architecturally sensitive, historically sensitive. If you're in the building that is dealing with mold and insect infection, not infection, what's the word? Anyway, you know what I mean. I would be happy to talk with you more about what your particular situation is and help you find a solution to that. Are there any plans to conduct another historic American building survey, given the last one was over 80 years old? Seems like it might be necessary given the building bloom in the latter half of the 20th century, not to mention the loss of many significant structures since then. So Historic American Building Survey, HABS, is very much active and alive. Just for those who are unfamiliar with the HABS program, this is actually, I think, the last New Deal program established by Roosevelt in the 1930s that survives up until the present. The Historic American Building Survey basically hired out-of-work architects to go across the nation and document houses. And that still happens. There still is a HABS office on I Street in Washington, D.C. I know that is the case because I was a HABS intern many years ago. I documented 3 historic Russian Orthodox churches in the Northern Liberties area of Philadelphia. So they do still do programs, but nothing as extensive as what took place in the 1930s. And I agree with you, 1930s, 40s, 50s, the HABS program seems to have shrunk over the years, and I love those photos, right? Because what they do is they document, in many cases, buildings that haven't existed for decades and can really place you back into a context where these buildings survived and help you recover a lot of history. I would love to see that happen. I'm sure the HABS people would love to have their funding increased. I'm not quite sure what the politics are behind that, but I agree with you, that would be very welcome. I think in some cases, the HABS program has been eclipsed by the National Register program. The National Register, especially when we're talking about historic districts, does do these sorts of surveys where they document houses and they, in the whole area, and then they make that documentation available to researchers or to people who want to put their houses or neighborhoods on the National Register of Historic Places. So that might be another way around it. And if you're interested in doing a survey like that in your own area, I would strongly recommend that you contact your SHPO office. SHPO stands for the State Historic Preservation Office. They are the ones who administer these federally mandated programs. I hope that's a complete enough answer. I would like to share this meeting with my history advisory chair. Okay. Thank you, I'll text you. Okay, did I answer all of the questions? I think I might have. Are there any final questions that anyone would like to ask? Again, if you are in Utah and there's a project that you have questions about related to preservation, do not hesitate to reach out to me. Again, my email is david@preservationutah.org. I'm more than happy to talk through solutions to some of your pressing preservation issues. I'm more than happy to come out and do site visits if you would like me to, if that would be helpful. And anything we can possibly do to move the preservation ball forward here in Utah, I'm more than happy to take on. We, I should note, have even started to interact with some of our neighboring nonprofit historic preservation organizations. We are trying to save a building, for example, just on the on the southern border of Idaho, working with Preservation, excuse me, working with Preservation Idaho on trying to save that building. It's a courthouse. So we are happy to collaborate as much as we possibly can. And again, I just really appreciate the opportunity I have to speak to this group, and welcome further conversations. And with that, I don't know, Leah, if you want to end things or if I should end things.
I will end it. Thank you, David, and thank you everyone for joining us. Please keep an eye out for our next RHSP webinar. It's going to be on oral history essentials, ethics, and community engagement, and it's going to be on October 28th. To sign up for that, you can just head to our educational calendar at ccaha.org/events. So thank you.
Right. Thank you all.